Thank you to Phelps Construction for their generous sponsorship of this event. Phelps Construction's gift helps Save Ellis Island continue the rehabilitation work on the historic hospital complex. Thank you, Phelps Construction, for your generosity.
Welcome. Thank you for being with Save Ellis Island this evening. My name is Bonnie Linda Ziga, and I work with Save Ellis Island. This is the first virtual event in a dynamic new series, and we are thrilled to be able to have so many people join us. We're excited to have USA Today best-selling author of historical fiction, Susan Meissner, with us. With more than 500,000 books in print in 15 languages, Susan Meissner's novels include The Last Year of the War, named one of the best books of 2019 by Real Simple Magazine, As Bright as Heaven, which earned a starred review in Library Journal, and Secrets of a Charmed Life, a Goodreads finalist for Best Historical Fiction in 2015. Susan is a member of the Board of Directors for Save Ellis Island. A California native, Susan attended Point Loma Nazarene University and is also a writing workshop volunteer for Words Alive, helping at-risk youth develop a love for reading and writing. We are delighted to have you with us, Susan.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I am just thrilled to be here with you tonight in this interesting venue. It's wonderful how we've been able to use Zoom and other platforms like this to stay connected during a time of disconnect and for such a great cause. I'm just so happy to be here. I'm so thankful to Phelps Construction for sponsoring this event. And what I'm going to be doing next is I have some PowerPoint slides to show you that talk a little bit about the genesis of A Fall of Marigolds, which is the book that I set on Ellis Island, specifically the hospital buildings, which are the buildings that SEI strives to restore, and what you will be supporting tonight with your donations. And so I'm going to share those with you, talk a little bit about the book, and then I'm going to be answering some of your questions. And before I answer your questions, I'll be reading a little bit from the book too. For those of you that have not read it, I'll be reading from a very, very early chapter, so no spoilers. And for those of you that have read it, hopefully you'll enjoy hearing just a little bit of the story in my voice reading it to you. Okay, so I need to put my glasses on just while I switch over to my screen so that I don't hit the wrong button. Okay, and then Karen, if you could just make me a host. Thank you. Okay, so this takes just a couple of seconds to switch over to the screens. Okay, and then you might see a tablet of our faces off to the right. You can move that over a little bit if it seems like your tablet of faces is interfering with your view of the slide. But most of what you'll be able to see is is to the left anyway, so you won't miss a whole lot. So A Fall of Marigolds is a story that I wrote in 2013. I started it in 2012, finished it in 2013, and then it came out in 2014. And it has had two different covers. This happens sometimes with a book. When it came out in 2014, February of 2014, this was the original cover, the blue one, with you can see sort of lower Manhattan there in kind of a blue fog, and then those beautiful marigolds that are in the corners. And this was the cover until just this month, in June of 2020, my publisher, Berkeley, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, decided to give it a new look, partly because I have a few other novels written around the same time period, the early 20th century, and they feature a woman in profile like this. And they thought, well, let's try and give Susan's books kind of a brand look so that when somebody sees that look, they'll think, oh, I recognize that look. That's a Susan Meissner book. And A Fall of Marigolds was very distinct. It was my first book with Berkeley, and my subsequent books had these women in profile, or sometimes it was a woman with just half her face showing. So then they came up with this cover, which I love. I actually love them both. I'm really happy. I think whichever book you have, whichever book you buy, I'm very happy with the cover that is on either one. You can see with this new one, of course, that the woman who's kind of in profile there, she's holding a little nosegay of marigolds. You can see the Brooklyn Bridge there, and she's got a very reflective look on her face. She has a lot to think about. And so very quickly what the story is about, and then we'll move to some pictures, is it's a dual timeline story, which means I wrote it with 2 different time periods. And so there's a story that takes up the majority of the pages of the book, and that is set on Ellis Island in the hospital buildings. And there's also a story above it, kind of a framing story that begins this book, and then it's sprinkled out throughout the pages of the book, and then it ends with this contemporary story. It's a 9/11 widow. It's 10 years after 9/11, and she's still kind of stuck in her grief. She was pregnant the day her husband died in the Twin Towers, and he never got to meet his daughter because they had just found out. She had just found out she was expecting, and she never got to tell him. And so part of that is holding her back, and part of moving on from grief is moving on, and that can be tough. And so her name is Taryn, and she lives on the Upper West Side, and she's having trouble moving on from her grief. And then the larger story is a nurse on Ellis Island working in the isolation wards. Her name is Clara, and she's also grieving. This is what ties these women together, even though they will never meet. That and a scarf, which both women that scarf will enter both of their lives in different ways. And she's grieving because she lost the man she loved in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. And if you know anything about those 2 disasters, 9/11, which of course you probably do know much about because we lived through that one, you and I, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire happened a little over 100 years ago, and it was an awful urban disaster for New York, and 145 factory workers died in a fire in Lower Manhattan. And so she was there that day. The man she loved was in that fire and died. And so she's working on Ellis Island as a nurse. That's her profession. And she does not want to leave the island. All the other nurses go on to the ferry on Saturday nights to spend the night in town and get away from the hospital, which is their workplace. They work there, they live there in the dormitory, but not her, not Clara. She stays. Every Saturday night she stays because she can't move on from her grief either. And Ellis Island is kind of an in-between place. It's in between where the immigrant came from and where they want to be, which is America. And of course, if you were sick when you arrived, the hospital was a place where you could be made well and continue your journey. And if you could not, then you were sent back home. So that's the story. That's A Fall of Marigolds. And I'll answer some other questions about the book during Q&A time, because some of you asked some really good questions about why the scarf and why those marigolds. And so I'll answer those questions when we get there. But I want to tell you where the idea came from, because it came from this book. And it came when I wasn't even looking for an idea for a story. I love historical fiction. It's what I love to write. I've written many books that are historical fiction. It's what I love to read. I'm kind of drawn to history. I think history has a lot to tell us. It has a lot to teach us. And historical fiction especially teaches us while it entertains us. So it's one of those few ways of learning about history that allows you to experience history without having to leave this time zone. You don't have to time travel to go back in history if you're reading the pages of historical fiction. That's why I love it. And so I was at a Barnes & Noble one afternoon, my local one here, where I live in San Diego, and I was at the bargain table up front there, and that book right there, the Encyclopedia of Ellis Island, was on the bargain table. It was pictorial, so I knew that it was going to be full of pictures. So I just picked it up and started flipping through it, because I thought, I bet there's some really great story ideas in here, because I figured every immigrant is a story, right? And so I was just kind of looking through the pages, and I got to that ends, and I saw that picture of nurses. And that's when I learned there was a hospital on Ellis Island. I had never heard about there being a hospital on Ellis Island. I hadn't been yet, so I didn't know. And I didn't know there was a hospital there. And I didn't know there were nurses there that lived there, and that their mission was to make people well. Because, people came from 100 different nations through Ellis, and they brought with them diseases that had never been seen in America. And these were the heroes, these women that nursed as many as they could back to health. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got to write a story about a nurse, because I've read stories about immigrants coming through Ellis Island, but I had never read a historical novel about a nurse working on Ellis Island. I was just drawn to that picture. And so that's what I decided to do. But I knew nothing. I knew nothing about the hospital, nothing about Ellis Island. I knew I had my homework cut out for me. And the first thing I did was I got a hold of this video by Lori Conway, who I believe is on the call tonight, and who you'll be able to meet later this summer during our author series with Save Ellis Island. I think I watched this video probably 10 times because I bought it and I watched it. I kept watching it because it told me everything about this hospital that I had never heard about before. And I was very drawn by the pictures and the text and the beautiful narration by Elliot Gould. And so it was this, this video and then later the book that kind of just tutored me on the history of these hospital buildings and what it meant to the people that came through them. So I'm very grateful to you, Lori. Thank you so much for your hard work with that. Now, what happened was when I started writing the book is I wrote probably most of it, and I was planning to go to Ellis Island and see these hospital buildings. They weren't open to the public yet, not even on hard hat tours. This was 2013, or actually, yeah, it was 2013. And I had written to Janice Colella, who was very helpful to me, pointed me in the right direction a lot of times when I needed information. And she had arranged for someone to take me on a hard hat tour of the hospital buildings before they were even open to anyone else. And I was so excited to come. I had my plane ticket. I had everything ready to go. I even had my the ferry ticket to get over to Ellis Island. And 3 weeks before I was to come to New York for my first time ever, Hurricane Sandy hit. And I don't know if you remember that one, but Hurricane Sandy was pretty devastating to New York, New Jersey, all of the coastline there. It flooded Lower Manhattan, and it knocked out all the landing docks for Ellis Island. So Liberty Island and Ellis Island, if you'll remember, it was closed for over a year. There was damage and there were no landing docks. And here I was supposed to go see it so that I could see, did I get it right? When I wrote the story, did I get it right? And I couldn't go. I came to New York anyway. I was able to see the building where the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire had happened because the building survived. And I was able to look at Ellis Island from Battery Park and just kind of wave. There are many other things I was able to do, but I was not able to go to Ellis Island. Very grateful then for all the work that was done by this man here, Harlan Unruh. He wrote 600 and some pages of text, maps, schematics of Ellis Island. And I read this probably over and over too for the same reason, is that I couldn't go where I wanted to go to actually see it. So I'm very grateful for people that take the time and effort to write down things that should not be forgotten. Grateful too for all the wonderful pictures that are left to us. These pictures are from the time period. These are pictures from the contagious wards in the hospital buildings on Ellis. And pictures from the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which if you haven't read about it, I mean, it's a very sad story, but worth a read. Many things changed after this fire for garment workers, and especially, and unions, and safety, for the safety of workers. And so some good things happened from it, but it was not a good thing. But I had a lot to learn about the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire as well, and was able to learn from archived pictures and newspaper articles and things like that. Very helpful. Now, the first time I was able to go to Ellis then was a whole year after the book came out. This was after the landing docks had been replaced, and tours had resumed of Liberty Island and Ellis Island, and it was a whole year later. And so I took the tour, and I didn't tell anybody who I was, because I was afraid that if I came to the island and said, oh, here, I'm this author, I've written this book, here, would you like to see it? I thought, well, they don't know me, and they may not want to just take my book. And so I won't say anything until the very end of the tour. And then I might just mention it and see, because I don't want to come off as some author trying to wheedle her way into the bookstore at the museum. So we took the tour, and it was amazing for me because I was like seeing the pages of my book. And we get to the very end of the far side of the island. And I knew that where we were, I thought was Ward K, which they don't call it that anymore. The wards only had those alphabetical names for a little while. They had numbers after that. But I was pretty sure it was Ward K because it was where I had placed one of the patients in my story. And I asked our hat tour leader, I said, is that Ward K? And he goes, well, it is. How did you know that? And then I told him, I said, well, I've actually written a book. And he gave us a great tour, and I gave it to him as a gift. I said, thank you. That was a wonderful tour. It really was. It was a great tour. And I said, you don't have to keep it. You don't have to take it. I said, but if you want it, I'd love to give it to you. And it was a fall of Marigolds. And he took it. And he took it with gladness, which was nice because it started a wonderful relationship with Save Ellis Island, because he read it and he passed it around. I became friends with other people on board, became friends with Janice, was able to come back to the island many times for different events and take my own pictures, which has always been such a delight, and to have other events there, book signings, and then to watch the buildings that have been able to have work done to them, to watch them come back to life again has been especially meaningful to me. I'm very, very grateful. So you might want to know that there's been other translations of the book. I don't have a copy of the Czech version of A Fall of Marigolds, but these are the other international versions, which it's kind of lovely to see the different versions. Some of them have different titles, like the Italian one you can see there is called The Red Scarf. They changed the name, which some nations, foreign publishers will change the title if the American title doesn't quite work for their reading demographic there. So I enjoy seeing those other covers. So what I'm going to do now, let's see how much time we have. I think we have time. I'm going to read just a little bit from the pages of the book for you, and then we'll have some Q&A time. So the book starts actually with Taryn, who was that 9/11 widow. And I'm not going to start with that first chapter because I want to take you right to Ellis Island. And so Clara's is chapter 2. And this is the first time we meet Clara. And as you know, those two women, they never meet. But there is a scarf that kind of ties the two women together, not literally, figuratively. And Clara first sees this scarf when she's on Ellis. She's a nurse and she's in the contagious wards. And there's an immigrant, a Welshman, who's wearing it around his neck when he comes into the wards. He's been sent over because he did not pass his medical inspection. He was on a ship that was full of scarlet fever. In fact, his wife died of it. And so he's been sent to the contagious wards for an incubation time to make sure he's safe to go on. And he's wearing a scarf around his neck. It's her scarf, it's his wife's scarf. And Clara notices it because she can tell that is not a man's scarf. And so her eye is drawn to it because it's a woman's scarf. And it makes her remember him because she would see hundreds of patients a day come through the registration there. So the fact that he's wearing this woman's scarf is what is memorable to her. They don't meet yet though. This is her first chapter. And so I'll read just a little bit of that to you. So this is chapter 2, Clara, Ellis Island, August 1911. It was the most in-between of places, the trio of islands that was my world after the fire. For the immigrants who arrived ill from wherever they came from, the earth stopped its careful spinning while they waited to be made well. They were not back home where their previous life had ended, nor were they embracing the wide horizon of a reinvented life. They were poised between two worlds, just like me. The windowed walkway of the ferry house connected the hospital's bits of borrowed earth to the bigger island known as Ellis, a word that by contrast seemed to whisper hope. Beyond the hospital where I worked as a nurse was Battery Park in Manhattan, a short boat ride away. In the opposite direction were the Narrows and the blue satin expanse that led back to everyone's old country. The hospital at Ellis was the stationary middle place where what you were and what you would be were decided. If you could be cured, you would be welcomed on shore. If you could not, you would be sent back to where you came from. Except for this, I didn't mind living where the docks of America lay just beyond reach. I looked to her skyline with a different kind of hunger. 5 months had passed since I'd set foot on the streets of New York. I could see her shining buildings from my dormitory window, and on gusty mornings I could nearly hear the busy streets coming to life, but I was not ready to return to them. The ferry brought me everything I needed, and the nurses' quarters were tidy, new, and sea breeze fresh, though a bit cramped. I shared a room with another nurse, Dolly McLeod, who also worked and lived on island number 3, the bottom rung of Ellis's E-shaped figure. Our dormitory stood a pebble's throw from the wards where the sick of 100 nations waited. Their sole desire was to be deemed healthy enough to meet their loved ones on the kissing steps and get off the island. We cooled their fevered brows, tended their wounds, and nurtured their flagging hopes. Some were sick children, separated from their healthy parents. Others were adults who had diseases they had no idea they were carrying when they set sail. Others were too feeble-minded to make their own way in life, and despite their healthy lungs and hearts, they would be sent back to their home countries. They spoke in languages that bore no resemblance to anything familiar, long ribboned sentences looped together with alphabetic sounds that held no rhyme or meter. Some phrases we nurses had learned from hearing them so often. It seemed there were 1,000 words for dreams realized, and only one common whimper for the hopes interrupted. Many would leave the hospital island healthier than when they arrived, but not all, of course. A few would leave this world for heaven's shores. The work kept us busy from dawn to dusk. Sleep came quickly at night, and there were no remnants of the fire here. Dolly and a couple of the other nurses looked forward to going ashore on their days off, and they would come back to the island on the midnight ferry, smelling of cologne and tobacco and salty perspiration from having danced the evening away. In the beginning, they invited me to join them, but it did not take long for them to figure out that I never left the island. Dolly, who knew in part what kept me here, told me she had survived a house fire once. When she was 8, I wouldn't always feel this way, she said. After a while, the dread of fire would fall away, like a snakeskin. I was not afraid of fire. I was in dreadful awe of how everything you were sure of could be swept away in a moment. Okay, so now we're gonna, if you just give me a couple of seconds to send the baton back, we'll have some questions and answer times. Okay, now I can't find Karen. Oh, where are you? There you are. Okay, hold on. So I'm gonna send the baton back to Karen. Great. And now we can have questions and answers.
Okay, great. First question, Susan, is from Crystal DeLuce from North Salem, New York. Crystal asks, why did you use the scarf as the object to connect the two women, and why marigolds as the flower?
Those are excellent questions. I'm glad you asked them, because if you hadn't, I was gonna answer them in the PowerPoint presentation, so thank you. The reason why I chose a scarf is I had to have something tangible that would tie these two women together. I have written other books where I have 2 different characters in 2 different time periods, and something about their 2 different stories collides. And sometimes what brings them together is a ring or a diary or a house. There's usually something that, that ties the 2 women together, even if they don't meet, or in some cases, if they're family, and it can be like an heirloom. And I didn't know what I was going to use, but I wanted it to be something that could survive 100 years, because I knew I was going to be looking at having, they're separated by a century. And I thought, a textile, if it's cared for properly, can last 100 years and still be as beautiful as it was the day it was made. So I thought, well, what kind of textile could it be? And I thought like a wedding dress. Those are usually cared for, but I knew that immigrant man wasn't going to be wearing a wedding dress. I thought, what could he be wearing in line? Because they're in this long queue of people who aren't, they're not going on to the ferry to move on into New York. They're being taken to Island 3 to be kept in quarantine. And I thought, if he's wearing something of his wife's, what would he be wearing that Clara would notice? And so that she would notice him out of the 100 people she saw that day. And I thought, well, what if he's wearing her scarf around his neck? I said, that would draw her eye, and it would be reasonable that she would remember him. Otherwise, it might seem contrived that of all the people that she saw that day, she'd remember him. So that's why I picked a scarf. And then I had to make it interesting because a scarf alone is just, there's nothing like a wedding dress has poetry behind it, and a ring and other things, but a scarf really is just to keep you warm in the wintertime. And so I wanted to make it beautiful somehow. And marigolds I chose because I had already decided the scarf was going to be kind of an orangey red look, because when Clara sees it, it reminds her of fire. She was at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. She saw the man she loved in the window framed by flames. He was one of the many people that jumped that day. And she saw like a ring of fire around him. And so when she sees this scarf, it's also orange, kind of an orange color. That also reminds her of that day. And so there's reason for her to remember it. And so that, well, if I'm going to make it beautiful, what can I weave into the fabric of the scarf? And so I thought, well, what kind of floral thing would be orange? And there really aren't that very many orange flowers. And I remember the day I Googled it, the results weren't that many, because lots of flowers can be orange, but very few few flowers are orange all the time. Like a dahlia can be orange, but a dahlia can be any number of colors. But like poppies can be orange. California poppies are orange, but poppies, everyone thinks of World War I for poppies. Tiger lilies can be orange, but tiger lilies remind me of Peter Pan. And nasturtiums can be orange, but they don't sound pretty. They're pretty, but they don't sound pretty. And then when I thought, well, marigolds are orange all the time. But when I started thinking about using marigold as a motif, for especially for the strength and resiliency of the human spirit and love, marigolds didn't seem quite right because they smell kind of funky. If you've ever smelled a marigold, they have kind of a really odd fragrance.
Yes, they do.
They're
Yes, they
weird.
do.
And they're great for like keeping bunnies out of your vegetable garden because they have that weird smell. But no one uses marigolds for a bridal bouquet or a Mother's Day corsage because they're just weird. They're not your typical sweet smelling flower, but they can survive a hard frost. You can have marigolds in autumn. And I thought, I like that. I like how marigolds are like a metaphor for the resiliency of love, that it can take a hard knock. I mean, the hardest of knocks. To lose somebody you love is probably the hardest kind of love to survive, the loss of love. But I thought, that's a wonderful motif for love, is that it can survive the hardest pain. I thought, that's a flower I can use. And that's how marigolds got into the scarf.
That's great. Ricky Lynn McCarthy from Hillsborough, New Jersey asks, what is Susan's earliest exposure to Ellis Island? And was it that first visit that sparked her inspiration? The reason I ask is because I was first enchanted by the island before its restoration began in the year 1999. It was captivating and radiated a certain essence. I'd love to hear about Susan's experience and inspiration.
Well, I shared a little bit about my experience with Ellis and when I was speaking earlier, and the fact that I had never been when I wrote this book, and I always wished I could go. And I live on the West Coast, so and I hadn't even been to New York yet, except to fly out of JFK, and that's not going to New York if all you do is fly out of JFK. And so
it's not a good picture of New York.
No. I had always felt, and you might think this is odd, but I had always felt like I missed out because my ancestors came from Germany in the early 1700s to Pennsylvania. So they came like in that maybe third wave of immigration from Europe to the new country. And my dad's great grandfather had like a grist mill in the early 1700s, like before the Revolutionary War. So my family had long been here before Ellis, and my husband's family, they came earlier too. And so I don't have anybody on the manifest, that came from Ellis. And I kind of felt like, I don't know, like I missed out because it seemed like such an amazing thing. It's Ellis Island, where so many people came, and you got the Statue of Liberty there and that beautiful poem at the bottom of her feet. And yet when I finally got there after wanting to be there all this time, I felt a kinship there that despite not having family that went through it, I don't know, there's something about Ellis Island that just makes you feel like it's everybody's story. And maybe it's because, the statue is right there. And if you go to the Hard Hat Tour and you walk through the TB wards, you can see the statue from the windows there. And you can just, I don't know, you can just see that the people that were in those wards looking at that statue and wanting just to complete their journey. It just felt like that is everyone's journey who's in a place where they're having to wait for something good to happen. And you can almost feel it, but not quite. And so when I finally did get to Ellis, I really did feel like this is still my island, even though I missed out on the great big immigration wave.
Deborah Greenberg from Queens, New York asks, what gave you the idea to connect these two historic events, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and 9/11, and to connect Clara and Taryn through time?
Well, to be honest, I started with only Clara's story. In fact, I finished the book, what I thought was finished, and turned it in to my new editor at Berkeley, and it was only Clara's story. Up to that point, I had been writing other books with dual timelines. And for this one, I thought, I think I'll just write a historical novel with no contemporary story with it. And I turned it in, and my new editor said, well, why isn't there a contemporary story too? And I thought, I thought maybe you might just want a historical one. She goes, you know, I really like your other books. And I was new to them, and I thought, well, I want to make them happy. And I said, well, I guess I can. And I knew it couldn't be as long as Clara's story because it would make the novel too long. So I knew whatever I wrote had to be kind of a framework, like just over the top of Clara's story, because Clara's story was already 80,000 words. So whatever I wrote, I knew could only be like another 25 or 30, which would be less than half. And so I began thinking, well, what dovetails with Clara's story? And both my editor and I knew that 9/11, unfortunately, there are some echoes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. You know, it happened in Lower Manhattan. It was an urban disaster. People had to jump from windows because the fire escapes, well, the doors to the stairways were locked, and the fire escapes were, they were not in great shape. They fell. People got onto the fire escapes, and the stairs fell away. And so there were many, many women, especially seamstresses, stuck up on the 8th floor who couldn't get out, and they jumped, and that, which is what made it so terrible. And so we saw the similarities there, and my editor and I talked about, is it too soon for a 9/11 book? And she lives in New York, and she says, you know, I think it's okay. It's been 10 years. I think people are okay with there being a 9/11 book. And so I made it careful. I treated that memory carefully because we all went through that to one degree or another. And I thought, well, I'm not trying to force any kind of symmetry here. It already exists. And so what I tried to do with those two women then is they both felt like they were in between, you know, where they were and where they wanted to be. Where they were was happy and in love. Okay, well, that ended because both of them experienced loss. And where they wanted to be was happy again. But how do you become happy again when you've lost someone you love? The only way to do it is to really say goodbye to them. And that means moving on, and neither one of them knew how to do it. And so that I knew they had that in common, and that's what I used to kind of draw them two together, those two women together.
Dr. Lucille Sanzaro Eller from Montclair, New Jersey asks, what was your research process? Was it concurrent with writing, or did it precede your writing?
I had so much to learn before I wrote one word, so I feel like I probably did the lion's share of the research before I wrote anything. I knew so little. So I did rely on Lori's work and Barry Marino's work and that huge tome of work by Harlan. And so I pretty much spent only probably the first 4 or 5 months only researching before I felt like, I think I know enough now to begin writing. And then once I start writing, I have to refer back. Like I printed out a map of the island as it was back then, because you know it wasn't filled in back then. It was shaped like an E. There was bodies of water in between the islands. They were joined by a bit of land, but there was water in between. So I had that map to kind of keep me grounded on where I was. But the most of the research, the lion's share, was done before I wrote anything.
Claudia Damiano of Hillsborough, New Jersey asks, what motivated you to join the Save Ellis Island Board of Directors and help give back in order to preserve this rich history and save a national treasure?
Well, my heart was already in those buildings, because when I finally got to see them, I kind of fell in love, because again, it's history, it's our collective history, and I knew that they needed. When I saw the work that SEI was doing, and I knew that these buildings, if we don't do something, they will crumble into nothing, and that's always just sad to me. It always makes me sad when something historic crumbles into nothing because there was no effort made to protect it. Effort is being made to protect these, and I wanted to be a tiny little part of that. So I just said in my acknowledgments of the book that I would donate back a percentage of my royalties to SEI. And I thought, I'll do that, and it'll encourage my readers when they get to the acknowledgments and they read that. I think, well, that's something I can do, is that they might also join in on that effort. And I think perhaps maybe it was that caused the SEI board to reach out to me and said, would you like to join us? And I went, yes, I would love to, because I'm kind of far away. Whenever we have a board meeting, I'm always the one on the phone, but I don't care, because I'm a part of something really good that is going to keep these buildings from crumbling into nothing. It should not happen. The beauty of the immigration building is because people came around it and they invested in its legacy. And that's really all we need to do with those hospital buildings. And, that hospital was the most amazing public hospital in the history of the world. In its day, there was no other public hospital like it. And so it ought not to fade away.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad you put that in the end of your book. Anna Marie Van Eck of Rockaway, New Jersey asked, how did you decide on Ode on a Grecian Urn by Keats? Can you give some insight into the poem and how it ties into the theme of your novel?
It's kind of a funny story. At least it's funny to me because that poem, the thing is I had already decided that Clara was going to find a book of poetry in a certain patient's belongings, a man with a scarf who lost his wife to scarlet fever. He asks her, he's a tailor, and he asks her for his pattern book that's in his locked luggage in the baggage room. And she says to herself, well, she's not supposed to do that. Go and get one of the patient's belongings from the baggage room. They weren't supposed to do that, but she feels sorry for him because he lost his wife. And so she goes and sneaks in there and tries to find his pattern book. What she finds instead is she finds his book of poetry, and she can tell it's his. It was in his stuff. And there's more that happens that day. But anyway, she finds his book of poetry and decides, I'll bring that to him. It'll make him feel better because he's so sad. And she could tell that this was a loved book. And so she brings it to him, and I keep writing, and I think to myself, I'm gonna have to figure out what that poetry book is at some point. And I knew that I wanted to be somebody real, not some made up poet that I just made up. I want to be somebody real. And I thought, well, it's got to be somebody that could have written a volume of poetry that ends up in a man's luggage in 1911. So it had to be written before then, and I had it be his mother's book of poetry. So even before that, and so then I had to start looking, well, whose book of poetry could it be? And if I'm going to maybe use it, because why introduce something into the story if you're not going to use it? So if I'm going to use that book of poetry, what poem should I put in so that I can use it, or why even have it? Well, that was such an odyssey because all the poetry that I kept finding for that time period was really, really long, and I wanted a short poem, and all of it was very difficult to understand. So I'm reading all this poetry going, I don't know what this means. I don't know what this means. I don't know what it means. I get to Ode on a Grecian Urn, and I'm thinking, I don't know what this means. I'm thinking maybe, possibly I can use this, but I'm not sure because I don't know what it means. And so I had to go onto Google and type in, what does Ode on a Grecian Urn mean? And I got this wonderful result from some blogger who knew there would be somebody like me going, I don't know what this poem means. And he explained, well, it means this, and this is what the symbology means here. And I thought, I get it now. And this is perfect. It's perfect. It fits so well with the scene that it shows up in. And it was the right poem for the right moment in the story. So I'm just so grateful to that blogger because honestly, I probably would have had to put their roses are red, violets are blue because I was not able to find anything. But I'm just so glad that I found the Keats poem and that I found somebody who had the insight to tell me what it meant.
Thank goodness for Google.
Right?
Joanne Barclay from Glens Falls, New York asks, you wrote so vividly about what happened to the Twin Towers on 9/11. What was it like for you to write about that? And your use of colors in those verses were so vivid. Can you give us some insight on that as well?
Well, that was tough. I won't lie. When I wrote the scenes where Taryn is experiencing the horror of that day, I remember watching it from afar. I was living in Minnesota on that day, and of course, everybody was glued to the television that day. And I'm writing this, 10 years later. So I'm remembering what it was like, and I'm rewatching all the footage. All the news footage is there for the watching. If you just go on YouTube, it's all there. So I spent a couple of sad days just rewatching the news footage of that day. And I talked to a few friends who I knew lived there. Like I had some friends who lived in Midtown, and I asked them what it was like that day. And I had a friend who was visiting Lower Manhattan that day who walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and watched it from the Brooklyn side. but nobody that I knew was like right there. And I thought, I've got to find somebody who was right there. And it just seemed odd to start looking for that eyewitness, because it seems like trampling on somebody's pain. And so I happened upon it was like a blog, but it was really more of a journal, like an online journal for survivors to go in and just write down their experience, kind of in a cathartic way, so that they could, like, it was for posterity, of course, to say this is what it was like that day, but it was also for them to be able just to say, this is what it was like for me. And I just went on that site and read all these journal entries from people who were there. So these were people that had come out of the towers. These were people who were on the streets. These are people who had to run when the towers started to fall. And so I found a woman who was in the Millennium Hotel, and she came out of it, and just like my character did, you know, Taryn was in the Millennium Hotel. She was coming out of it when the first plane hit. And so I was able to use that woman's, what she was seeing and feeling and tasting, to be able to give those same sensations to my character, because I knew they were real, because they had happened to a real person. And so it was her experience, this woman who said that after the towers fell and you realized you were still alive, you know, covered in ash and whatever that dust was, you know, everyone was covered in it. When you realized you were still alive, everyone, all they wanted was water, and how they stumbled into buildings and broke windows to go in and even drink from a toilet, because you needed water so badly. And so I used imagery like that, because I knew that it was raw and real, and the real deal. And so they weren't easy scenes to write, but they were real. But I also gave I think that the amount of respect that event requires, because I felt like I didn't have to like interview anybody and say, tell me what it was like. You know, I was able to find these journal entries and kind of just read from afar what it was like, and not have to like somehow, you know, trample on someone's experience. And so anyway, that's how I was able to write those scenes.
You did an incredible job. You really did. I lived in New Jersey at the time, and the color part just really struck me, because everyone who lived in the greater Manhattan area that day remembers the color of the sky.
You know, every account that I read of it mentioned that same thing. It was a Tuesday morning where the sky was just a huge sapphire. It was a beautiful morning. It was like, who would have believed? You would never have been able to convince anybody that morning that this is going to be a terrible day, you know, because the sky was just, an amazing shade of blue.
It was absolutely gorgeous. You did a wonderful job with that. This is my personal question for you. Reading the book for this program, one thing that really struck me about your book was this idea of the in-between time. And I think everyone probably in the world has been living in an in-between time recently. And I wondered why that was such an important part of each of your characters' journey. Because I think we can all, maybe not the lost part of it, but that sort of oddness of just kind of hanging out in a time where you're not moving forward, and it's just an odd time.
Right. Well, whenever I choose a setting for a book, I'm always looking to see, well, what does this setting give me? Because every setting gives you things. Like if I were to choose a setting like a coast, like maybe I set the story at the ocean. The ocean gives you things like, you know, the ocean is massive. It's can be scary. It can be calming. All of those things the ocean gives you as its setting. Well, Ellis gives me things too, because Ellis is in the middle of the river, right? It's in the middle of an immigrant's journey. It's in the middle of where they were, where they want to be. It's for people at the hospital. It was in the middle of them being able to, you know, be made well or die or be sent back home. So for all of the people on the island, they were in an in-between place, in between not just land and where they had been, but in between, being able to be in America and not back in the old country. So I thought, well, if I'm using an in-between place as a setting, well, how can I use it in the story? Because all of those things that a setting gives you they're metaphorical. You can use them in the lives of your characters. And I thought, well, if I'm going to have that nurse on the island in an in-between place, shouldn't I take advantage of that and make her in an in-between place too? Because then it seems it's suitable that she's there. And so, I kind of looked for something that would have happened to Clara to put her in an in-between place. So I chose the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. I looked for something that she unfortunately would have to experience. I'm kind of cruel to my characters. I looked for something to put her through that would send her to that in-between place, and everyone else wants to leave it, but not her.
If you're not cruel to your characters, you're not doing your job.
I know. I figure if I send her there and everything's fine, that's a really short book that nobody will want to read. There's got to be something not right, and it's got to be big, and it's got to be 400 pages before she figures it out. Otherwise, it is a very short book that no one's going to want to read. And so I put her in an in-between place on purpose, and I used the islands in between this to have her figure it out. That's what was wrong with her. And other people were telling her too, you've got to move on, you've got to move on. And deep down, she probably knows, but she doesn't want to, because moving on means really saying goodbye, and she doesn't want to. And I did the same thing with Taryn. Taryn, it's 10 years after 9/11. A lot of the other people have moved on, not her. She, hasn't even thought of dating another man. And so for her, and both Clara and Taryn, if you read the book, have other reasons why they don't want to move on. They both got some survivor guilt, and I'll let you read the story to figure out why they do. But it's also another reason why they don't want to move on. And and because I wanted these two women who will never meet, I wanted the connection to be really clear. I put them both in that in-between place, so that there was no mistaking why their two stories are dovetailed together. They're two women separated by a century, but are experiencing the same kind of guilt and trouble with fully letting go and allowing themselves to love again. Because if you're going to move on from love that lost, it means allowing yourself to love again, which of course is kind of scary.
So we have a few questions too that have come in during the program. Lori Conway, author of Forgotten Ellis Island, asks, once you walk the hallways of the hospital, what was your reaction to the actual buildings versus just reading about them?
I don't know if it's true for everybody or just historical lovers like me, but I feel like the buildings are talking to me. It feels like, like if you touch the walls, like you can hear the echoes of the past, and your feet, you're walking on the past, you're walking on the past, and those walls, I mean, they are like, if only these walls could speak, all the stories they could tell. And so I kind of feel that way whenever I'm in a historical building, especially one that hasn't been, some historical buildings have been restored to the point of overdoneness, so that you can't even imagine the life that the building had before. But, Ellis Island's hospital buildings, because they're in stages of restoration, they're still almost in their original state, albeit, in a fragile original state. So it was feeling like, even though all the survivors, like there's nobody alive from I could talk to from that time, the building seemed alive, even with all the, the scaffolding and other things they've had to do to protect the buildings, they felt alive to me. It was great.
Yeah, if you're out there listening and you haven't had a hardtat tour, it is absolutely a incredible and compelling experience.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is from Lou Posada, who asks, was there anything you would change based on your visit to the hospital? So once you went to the hospital and saw it, was there anything you would have gone back and done differently?
Yeah, I thought about that after I had a chance to go, and the book was already out, so I knew that I couldn't change anything really because I was kind of stuck with it. But I wanted to like maybe to have a like to answer a question like this, and I began to think, was there really anything I didn't get quite right? And I feel like maybe the nurses' dormitory, I kind of had to guess. I was guessing where I thought it was. And because I wasn't quite sure, and, I gave them a library and I wasn't quite sure where that was, I was kind of nebulous whenever Clara would go to the library. I never exactly said where it was because I was never able to quite get it right. And so in those areas of the hospital buildings where I wasn't quite sure, I did kind of leave it open-ended so that if I did ever find out where those things were and how it was, that I wouldn't be too disappointed with how I left it.
Yeah, I thought you did a remarkable job.
Thanks.
And those buildings, it's hard to orient yourself.
Yeah.
I have several maps marked up because when I'm writing or thinking about it, wait a minute, was this that building or was this that other building? So I'm just going to ask if anyone else in the chat would like to submit a question for Susan. Well, thank you so much again, Susan, for participating in this wonderful event tonight. We are really grateful to you for giving us your time. Thank you again to Phelps Construction for their sponsorship. And if you want to learn even more, visit our website, saveellisisland.org, to learn more about the preservation and restoration work being done and ways that you can help save the historic hospital complex.